Hey, it's Alge, and this is Simple Lines Anatomy. So, we had another question from one of our followers, getting a lot of those recently, which is nice. We love talking to people. And he asked, how does the right psoas cause back pain, or how can it? Which is, in a lot of ways, an open-ended question. We could take it in a few directions, and we're going to try to summarize it in a sensical way, a simple way that makes sense to as many people as possible. So, looking at that psoas, understand that it is known as a hip flexor. So it's doing something like that. It is bringing the femur up towards the lumbar spine. And its attachments give it the ability to do this, as any muscle does, because it attaches to L1, 2, 3, and 4 in the transverse process vertebral body area, and then inserts into the lesser trochanter of the femur. So what it does is it will contract and bring those two things closer together in a motion we call hip flexion. And that would be around a vertical axis. Not a vertical axis, a transverse axis. Oh boy, what a day. Okay, so anyways, we have to figure out how the muscle can create a problem. Now we're going to assume for the first part that this muscle is in fact short, meaning it's pulling on its attachment points. And now, looking at the muscle, let's look at it in a very simple way first. Notice most of its orientation, whether you're looking at the left or right, and this is the right side here, just to clarify. Looking at the left or right, most of its orientations are pretty clear. It's largely down, so it will pull in that direction vertically, and some of it is actually lateral, because it goes from medial to lateral. So therefore, it's going basically, summating, it would be going this way, which is the exact orientation of the muscle. That's just how that works. So because of that, we have to assume that if it's pulling on the low back, it's going to pull it in that direction, and it will carry the lumbar spine in that direction. Now, because it's pulling this way, it's going to pull on anything that can rotate. If we're looking at it, so this is a side view, the psoas muscle is essentially doing that. It's going to be pulling it relatively forward, just to start, if we're looking at it from a side view. And if we're pulling one side forward, because we are talking about the right side specifically, it will create a rotation. Now, what this does, it's not just as simple as a rotation, because this particular area doesn't really rotate. The L1, 2, 3, 4 doesn't do much in the way of rotation. And because the muscle will pull in a unified way, because notice that it's a convergent muscle, it's a triangular shaped muscle, this means that it will pull 1, 2, 3, 4 as a whole. Because 1, 2, 3, 4 doesn't really rotate, it's going to go to the next available area of rotation, which is L5. And because it's pulling on the right side, it should pull in this direction. And we call that, just so everyone's clear, we call that a left rotation, because the vertebral bodies are now facing to the left. That's how that's named, just to be clear. Now, at the same time, because it's pulling forward but also down on this right side, we're also going to get, at L5, a little bit of a side bend to that side. So it's going to rotate to the left, side bend to the right, if that muscle was short and if that muscle was pulling on the lumbar spine. So the leg, we have to assume that the leg is fixed, because we're asking how it could create problems in the low back. Now this alone is actually not a problem, because the psoas muscle should be doing this quite regularly. It's not abnormal. If ever your leg is more stuck than the low back, then it means the low back is the one pulled on. That's just a simple way of looking at that. But over time, it can create problems. It can create strain. Now, one of the areas that we have to consider is that the SI joint is right here. Two SI joints, of course, sacroiliac joints. And they're going to be loaded in kind of a funny direction, because if the lumbar spine is essentially pushing down on it, because there is an element of down and there is an element of bending to the side, it means that sacrum is going to be twisted a little bit as well. It's at least eventually, maybe not right away, but eventually it could be put in a position it's not used to. So for instance, if it's coming down this way, this right corner will be coming like so, forward and down, and the back corner will be pulled by the attachments of the lumbar spine backwards and relatively up, because the sacrum essentially, just looking at it from a side view, the sacrum essentially goes like this. So it's got a little bit of a 45 going on. So the front right corner would be doing this, and the back left corner would be coming like that. This is what we think anyways, if it was perfectly planar mechanics, and it's not always as straightforward as this. So that means that we've got both an L5 position and a sacrum position. And again, this alone is not a huge problem until it's all you're capable of doing. Understand that over time, with movement, the stress on the sacroiliac ligaments, which would be right about there, on the anterior side would be lengthened. And with heavy loading or repeated loading, they can become strained. On the posterior side, of course, we've got strain on the posterior sacroiliac ligaments, which would be, give or take, right about there, and just on the back side. And they could be strained as well. And this could cause pain in the L5-S1 sacrum area, potentially. It's very much exacerbated by initiating heavy loading too. So when we put a bigger weight into the spine, this natural pressurization or this constant pressurization becomes much more dangerous. High speed, high loading really bring out the weak points in the human body. And that's just how anything works. That's basic mechanics. It's biomechanics, but it's just simple physics too. So now, that being said, we've got this big rotation coming into the L5 area. That's a big kind of twisty area. Not to get technical, but L5 can do a big twist like this. Now, the thing is, if we want to stay straight forward with our body, we've got to twist somewhere else. We can't be facing to the left all the time. So we've got to twist this way somewhere higher up. And now typically that happens at about T11, 12. Now you could just put your head that way. I mean, you could do it at the atlantoaxial joint, but realistically it's going to happen somewhere in the spine. And so this 11 and 12 area is more than likely going to twist in the opposite direction to make sure that we don't stay facing one direction all the time. The legs are forward, but the body's facing to the left. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So we twist to compensate. A compensatory twist would happen. This, again, not a huge problem, unless you consider that now these two things are being pulled apart in a significant way. They're being pulled apart enough to cause strain. So if this one is going one way, it's pulling that way, and this one is going that way, it's pulling this way. And we generally create a point of shear or pull. And this is both through the front and the back. And so now we're into more of a widespread thing. And this will be more and more shown with twisting motions. And even though it's not a huge problem to do normally, even though it's not a huge problem in small amounts, as it gets bigger and bigger and more involved, it can be a bigger and bigger problem. The more you load that spine, the more you expect it to move under pressure, the more potentially we can have problems. Simple as that. Okay, so that's one option. But we've got other options, being that the psoas is assumedly short. So the psoas is known as really an extensor. It's known as an extensor of the lumbar spine, and that's very reasonable to say because it's most of the time true. And it's an extensor because of its orientation. So that's the psoas on the front side of the lumbar spine. Again, L1, 2, 3, 4. Let's shorten that up a little bit. There we go. L1, 2, 3, 4. That's not quite accurate, but there we go. It pulls here. So again, it's pulling forward. It creates this pivot point. This is kind of neat, but it creates this pivot around the pubic bone here. And there's actually a bursa over that to help protect that psoas tendon from getting damaged by pulling over that bone. It doesn't make a lot of sense to put a tendon over a bone unless you've got a fluid pad to essentially absorb some of the stress and strain there. It's a pseudo joint, if you will, in a lot of ways. That's what bursas are kind of for. So normally we would expect it to essentially pull forward on the lumbar spine because of the way it goes. And this creates extension, that pulling forward. That's what we call lumbar extension, a anterior word motion. Now, what we've found is that if we change the orientation of those attachment points, and this is not necessarily psoas' fault, but if we have normally a spine that goes like this, that is a flexion curve and extension curve. If the spine normally goes like that, but we change all those curves. We make that a generally flattened curve. And especially if we make that flattened curve just so happen to really flex at around L1, L2, we change the orientation of the pull, because now instead of being a rounded curve, it's more like this. It's a flat area to pull off. So that psoas now is pulling essentially like so. So it's coming down and pulling that direction. So in this particular case, it will sustain the flexion. Even though it's technically a lumbar spine extensor, it has a great capacity to sustain the flexion. So it's as if it was able to do this. It's really just pulling this direction down, but that has a capacity to sustain flexion. Now, that alone, again, is not a big deal. There's lots of people with flexed spines, and it's kind of an epidemic because of the whole, computer cell phone thing, and lack of physical exercise. But what it does is it pulls all the way around. So you really have to always view the body as a continuum. So if this side is pulling this way, well, guess what? The back side is pulling this way. And alone, not a big deal, but consider what's on the back there. Consider that we have lots of erector muscles on the back. We've got lots of erector muscles that, roughly attach like this, for like iliocostalis and semispinalis and longissimus and all. You can make up all your names you want, and they will be lengthened. They will be lengthened to an extreme. And now the lengthen, again, not a problem until you add a lot of flexion to the curve, and this starts to strain those tissues. This starts to make them strain to the point of pain, potentially generating back pain. Maybe you're sitting normally, not a big deal. You go to lift something, all of a sudden, guess what? Horrible, horrific pain. Not fun. Now, that is how the psoas might create pain in the back, but we have trouble believing that that psoas muscle can act entirely alone. So let's just consider some alternates here. The first one we're going to talk about is the leg generating psoas pull, because a contraction is one thing, but mechanically, if it's attached to a lower point, it should be able to pull from low to high without any contraction whatsoever. Now, there's going to be a bit of contraction, but consider for a second if we just harshly internally rotated that leg. If the lower attachment point here is the lesser trochanter, and we bring it backwards, we bring it back deeper in. So if we're looking at it again from the side, if the lesser trochanter is about here, it essentially gets translated backwards like this, lengthening that psoas muscle. It goes a little bit further. It's a little bit longer than it should be. That means this psoas is basically being pulled straight down. Again, it's going to be pulled to the side and down, and summating in this basic 45, this oblique angle. So that means we can get the psoas to pull on the lumbar spine, generating all those things we talked about before, generating side bend rotation at L5 and potentially an opposite rotation at 11 and 12, simply because of the position of the leg. Now, realistically, most people don't have a harshly internally rotated leg. If there's a traumatic injury, yes, that is possible. But a lot of the time you will find that the leg is doing quite the opposite. The leg is doing external rotation, and it's more one side than the other, if we're going to be specific. Left or right, whatever you want to do. Everybody's different. But if it's externally rotated, we're going to get it someday. Externally rotated, this is a bit more normal. And so this results in a laxity or a loosening off of that psoas muscle. And what that can do, let's say we put it on the opposite side. In fact, we'll just get rid of all this. Let's say we put it on the opposite side. We externally rotate that left leg, and now these fibers are just a little bit loosened up, and they're not stabilizing the lumbar spine. Guess what the opposite side is going to want to do? It's going to want to contract harder, and it pulls, again, in that same way. So consider that for a second. Consider the fact that if you loosen a muscle, you destabilize the structure. This is basically just as bad as over-tightening the muscle, and you have to consider this. Now, there's a lot of options in generating forces from the bottom up, because we have multiple joints here. So if this is, again, the whole leg from the hip down, consider that we can change the angles of most of these structures. So the knee often can come in on a funny angle, and the ankle can do very much the opposite. So if we were given a simple example of the hip doing a valgus strain, so it comes into adduction, say by the adductor muscles, and the knee has to do the opposite to compensate. We're heavily exaggerating here. And the foot has to do the opposite again. We get a change in the position of the leg. This can also result in some internal and external rotations for sure, and we can essentially get the same effect. And even though technically the psoas is unrelated in a way, it can still be affected by everything going on below it. You could have a foot problem that causes a low back problem by this. Of course, you have to consider all of the joints. You can't just, consider one. You can't just say it's all the fault of this foot, because as soon as one changes, the other changes. But this is well worth considering if you're thinking the psoas is actually an issue. You need to see it as a continuum of structures, part of a bigger whole. Okay, now I've got another one for you. So let's clear this off. How can one muscle work alone? It can't. By definition, a muscle requires a nerve to contract. That is very necessary. It's without it, it makes no sense, because muscles are not, they have some self-action through muscle spindles and all that, but they do need a nerve at some point to tell it what to do. And typically the psoas is like L1, 2, 3, with a bit of variation in there, which is totally fine. But how can that muscle really contract entirely by itself, especially for a sustained period of time? How can it contract, or how can it be short? And usually when it's short, it's put in either too long a position of strain or too short of position for a very long period of time. But let's talk about a little bit of calibration too. So this psoas muscle has a partner, and it is the iliacus. And in fact, it makes the iliopsoas muscle. And it really should be considered a single muscle in a lot of ways, with two bigger fibers. That's what makes sense. And many muscles, in fact, do this. We separate them in our heads only. We separate them for academic purposes. So in any case, we've got this iliacus and psoas. The iliacus does more pure flexion of the hip, whereas the psoas does both flexion, and if you start in a internal rotation, it will external rotate. So it's two fibers just pulling in different directions. This is the same way that the glute max, for instance, has multiple fiber orientation, or the trapezius, which we consider a single muscle, has three major orientations. In any case, these two must calibrate to each other. It doesn't make sense that they wouldn't communicate, because they have roughly the same innervations, roughly the same nerves. So we have to consider that if one were to contract, if we had a whole bunch of contractions here, that the psoas muscle should cross-reference that, because it will be pulling as a unit. So I have to consider that the iliacus could be part of the psoas problem. It's worth doing. It's worth really looking at for sure. And once we start adding in that iliacus, because its attachment points are inanimate and into basically cross-communicating with some of the other hip flexors, for instance, the rectus femoris, there we go, we have to consider those muscles as well. Again, it's part of a greater whole. Now, further to that, and we're not going to go too deeply into this, understand that there is an element to every muscle of contraction inhibition. Reciprocal inhibition would be the technical term, or agonist-antagonist. So if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to make this psoas muscle here on the right side contract really, really hard. It's going crazy. If I wanted to add to that, I can actually go to the opposite side of the spine and contract the opposite. There would be like glute maximus. These are paired for gait cycles purposes. So on the back side, it's an anterior posterior. So if the glute max is roughly here, a few fiber orientations, and the psoas on the opposite side, we're saying that's the left and this is the right here, they will work in a paired way that needs to happen for us to walk effectively. However, it also works in the opposite. So if I contracted the glute max, this is getting real messed now. The glute max on the right side, it would in fact inhibit, it would take away from the psoas on the right side. So these are things we all have to consider. The psoas can't be considered in isolation. It doesn't make any sense. So when considering how it can create back problems, you can see it as an effector, something that makes it change. But then you have to see how it was put into position, how it was stimulated to create a problem, or how the lack of stimulus could create a problem. Again, we've been Simple Lines Anatomy. We got some social media or whatever. And this iPhone app, Android app, that's pretty cool. And we're considering some big changes. We're open to suggestions, but right now we've been thinking of changing the app's content. Instead of anatomy quiz questions and pictures, we're thinking instead just like one big picture of a moose.